Okay, we're going to start by looking at the first of the level 2 theories, which is related to deviant or atypical sexual interest. Now, the most commonly studied of these is pedophilia, or sexual interest in children. So that's the one that we're going to focus on for this video. Now, thinking about what pedophilia actually represents, it's a persistent pattern of sexual arousal aimed towards prepubescent children. Now, what a lot of people will assume is that somebody who is paedophilic is somebody who will be sexually aroused to a range of different age groups of children, but their predominant sexual interest will be in children generally. Now, this is a little bit of a fallacy. We know that there's kind of a span of age ranges that people who have paedophilic sexual arousal patterns do demonstrate, but it's important to consider Michael Sito's theory of chronophilias when we're thinking about paedophilia and trying to be very specific about what we're talking about here. So the theory of chronophilias is an age-graded theory of the targets of exclusive or predominant sexual interest or sexual attraction. Essentially what it suggests is that people can be primarily or predominantly attracted to particular age groups or body types, and that gives us some indication as to what chronophilia they may have. So, for example, if someone is nephrophilic, then they will be typically aroused by infants up to the age of 2. We next have a category that most people have heard of, which is pedophilia. This is a sexual arousal pattern towards prepubescent children, typically between the ages of 3 and 10, although these ages are not necessarily too helpful. Then we have hebephilia, which is a sexual arousal pattern towards pubescent children, which is typically between the ages of 11 and 14. We then have ephebophilia, which is a sexual arousal pattern towards adolescents between the ages of typically 15 and 17. This is a very controversial chronophilic subtype, and a lot of people will suggest that this shouldn't necessarily be a specific subtype in and of itself, because a lot of people who are of the next chronophilic subtype of a teleophilic orientation will also find ephebophilic targets quite attractive. There may be evolutionary reasons for this, but there's a lot of controversy about whether ephebophilia actually represents its own distinct subcategory of chronophilia. Then we have teleophilia, as I've just said. This is kind of what we might refer to as the normal or the typical chronophilic subtype, so a sexual arousal pattern towards sexually attractive and sexually mature adults, typically up to the age of around 40. We then get into mesophilia and gerontophilia, which is a sexual arousal pattern where arousal is targeted towards middle-aged and older-aged adults. Now, what a lot of people will assume is that just because somebody has a particular chronophilic orientation or chronophilic sexual arousal pattern, that this gives us some indication about their risk of offending or their offending behaviour. What we can say is that these labels don't necessarily tell us anything about offending status whatsoever. We know that there are teleophiles who do commit acts of rape and teleophiles who don't commit acts of rape. We also know that there are hebephiles or paedophiles who do commit sexual offences and some who don't. Now, these are really important distinctions to draw, because we know that there are kind of very widespread conflations between typically words like paedophilia and child sexual abuse, and that's a conflation that we'll look at in just a couple of seconds' time. Now, as I said, the age categories that are kind of inherent within this chronophilic theory aren't too useful, and that's because when we're looking at someone, when we're judging their maybe their sexual attractiveness, we're not judging someone by the chronological age that they are. We're maybe looking out for physiological markers that we find sexually arousing or sexually attractive, and it will be those physiological markers that we're drawn to. Now, one way of getting around this that doesn't necessarily rely on an age of a target would be to look at their Tanner stage of physical sexual development. I will flash up now a picture of cartoons of naked children and adults, so just kind of be aware of that. But just to demonstrate what the Tanner stages look like, Essentially what we're looking at in females is, or in girls and women, we're looking at kind of breast development and pubic hair growth, and in boys and adolescent boys, we're looking at genital growth and pubic hair growth. And what we're suggesting is that people who are paedophilic typically will be attracted to kind of a Tanner stage 2 body type. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who is attracted to a Tanner stage 3 isn't paedophilic, but at the same time what we're suggesting is that these are typical body types that correspond to specific chronophilic subtypes. So hebephiles, for example, will be attracted to a Tanner stage 3 to a Tanner stage 4. If hebephiles will typically be attracted to a Tanner stage 4, possibly a Tanner stage 5. So yeah, that's the kind of idea of chronophilias and Tanner stages as they relate to those chronophilias. Now, as I've just said, there's a conflation in the not just in the academic literature but also in public culture about paedophilia and what it means in relation to sexual offending, and this is typically spanning from kind of widespread media coverage of child-based sexual offences, where the label paedophilia is used to represent the perpetrators of these crimes. Now, this isn't to say that people who are paedophilic don't commit sexual offences, because some subtype of them do, but that doesn't necessarily represent the entirety of the population who are paedophilic or who have paedophilic sexual arousal patterns. What I'm going to show you now is a very quick video of a sex researcher, James Cantor. He is arguably the world's authority on the neuroscience of paedophilia. So we're going to have a quick look at what he said in relation to his research and into some of the kind of neurobiological bases of paedophilia. I'm sure you'll agree that Cantor's work is very provocative in terms of what it means as our kind of definition of paedophilia develops. Back in 2012, Michael Cito, who's another kind of high-profile researcher in this area, set forward a review of the existing literature on sexual orientation, and he thought that there were kind of various different criteria that we could use to see whether or not paedophilia in this case matches that definition of sexual orientation. He suggested that a sexual orientation has an early age of onset, so kind of around the age of puberty, maybe slightly earlier than that. It has stability over time, it's not fluid and you can't change it through things like conversion therapy. And there's a high degree of correlation between sexual and romantic behaviour, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a future video when we look at emotional congruence. But just to kind of do a very quick review of this research, we know that people who are paedophilic recognise this very early in life, so typically in the kind of the very early teens, so just before puberty. We know that paedophilic sexual interests and sexual arousal patterns are stable over time. They don't tend to change too much. There is some degree of non-exclusivity about them, so just because somebody has sexual interest in children, it doesn't mean that they won't have simultaneously sexual arousal towards adults, but we know that there is a range of people within that. But we do know as well that people who are actively working to maybe change paedophilic sexual interests are not being successful in that. So we know that there are some people who maybe claim that they can change sexual interest towards children, but the statistics behind some of those studies don't necessarily hold up. And we also know that there is a degree of correlation between sexual and romantic behaviour in people with paedophilic sexual arousal patterns. And we know this because the more exclusive somebody is paedophilic rather than teleophilic, then the higher the incidence of them self-reporting falling in love with a child is, and the lower the incidence of them declaring that they've fallen in love with an adult. There is a degree of correlation, therefore, between sexual and romantic behaviour. Now, this obviously has real implications for how we view paedophilia as maybe a risk factor for sexual offending, and how it maybe links to child sexual abuse as an offending behaviour. What we do know from some of the bigger studies is that less than 50% of all child sexual offenders, those who have been convicted of child sexual offences, are truly paedophilic. So Schmidt and colleagues have done kind of large-scale studies looking at paedophilic sexual interests. They've looked at explicit and implicit assessments of sexual arousal towards adults and children, and they found that less than half, just under half, of all people convicted of sexual offences against children actually meet the criteria for being classified as paedophilic. In some of the more wide-ranging community-based work, typically again done in Germany, around 4% of all community-based men, in a very large sample of almost 9,000, self-reported using sexual fantasies involving children during masturbation. Now, 4% is not a small figure. If we think about the fact that the upper estimate of paedophilia as a very specific type of chronophilic attraction pattern is around 1%, according to Michael Sito's estimates. 4% of men using sexual fantasies involving children in masturbation is a large number. If we then expand that to people who may suggest that they find children sexually attractive, or that some people could find children sexually attractive, anywhere between 9.5% and 20% of adult men seem to suggest that, at least to some people, not necessarily to them, but to some people, children could be sexually attractive to some degree. And if we look at some of the more kind of ecologically valid measures of sexual interest in children, we know that from Bergen's work, up to 1 in 4, so 25% of people, will continue to sexualize a conversation with someone that they believe to be a minor. So in this study it was the age of 13 or 14. Now, this isn't necessarily looking at paedophilia, but it is suggestive that we do have relatively large numbers of adult men within the community who have latent or kind of undercurrents of sexual arousal towards children. Now, this obviously has big implications for our risk assessments. We know that paedophilia is associated with child sexual offending. We know that people who are convicted of child sexual offences and who also have sexual interests in children that are maybe uncontrollable, or they feel are uncontrollable, are at a greater risk of reoffending. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people with paedophilic sexual interests are inherently a risk for committing acts of child sexual abuse. The difference here is that the baseline populations of these people are, on the one hand, people with sexual convictions, and the other hand, people with no convictions. And it may be that within a subtype of people who have convictions, sexual interest in children increases their risk of reoffending, whereas people in the community who maybe don't have so many antisocial personality traits, that sexual interest pattern has less of an effect. Now, related to that, we also know there are large numbers of people within the community who have paedophilic sexual interest or sexual interest in children more generally, and they don't offend. They actively work to prevent offending among that community. One website that is very kind of prominent at the moment is Verped, or Virtuous Pedophiles. What they do is they operate a forum. They have various people on social media platforms who work to actively support people with paedophilic sexual interests to not offend, to refrain from offending, and to improve their mental health in relation to their sexual arousal patterns. Now, just on that, we know that there are, again, large numbers of people with these sexual arousal patterns within the community. What would you do if you had that kind of sexual arousal pattern? Would you go to your GP? Do you think your GP would be able to help you? There's various kind of pieces of work going on all over the place, looking at kind of where do people seek help from? What are some of the barriers to help-seeking behaviour? Social stigma and the fear of discovery seems to be a really big feature that hinders people coming forward and prevents them seeking help when they may need it. A lack of expertise, a lack of professionalism, a lack of congruence between therapist aims and people with paedophilic sexual interest, their aims in treatment as well, seem to be barriers towards help seeking. So I would just encourage you to think about, what would you do if you were in this kind of situation? Who would you seek help from? What would your hopes and worries be? Kind of considering these questions does give us an indication as to maybe where some of the aspects of society are that we might need to improve when we're trying to prevent sexual abuse and increase people's mental well-being around an unchosen sexual arousal pattern. So just to reiterate, the differences between paedophilia and child sexual abuse is that paedophilia is a persistent pattern of sexual interest or arousal towards prepubescent children. Child sexual abuse is the act of committing a sexual offence against a child. Now, these are different things. Not all child abusers are paedophiles, and not all paedophiles are child abusers. It's a really important distinction to kind of make in this area of research. We know that paedophilia differs from child molestation, but it may motivate child molestation in some way, and that having any kind of predominant sexual interest does seem to guide how we seek out opportunities for sexual gratification. And we'll look at a few of the models that might help us to understand what that link exactly looks like in a few videos' time. So that's the initial area of deviant or atypical sexual interest in children. We'll look at one sub-aspect of that now, which is emotional congruence.